A lot of times we come to experience God's commandments as being kind of burdensome and oppressive, but in contrast, John Paul II says, look at the Old Testament. And so if God wanted to keep the Israelite people, for example, in slavery, all he had to do was leave them in Egypt. But instead what he did was that he liberated them from slavery in Egypt, and then only after that gave them the 10 Commandments. So what this tells us is that God's commandments are not meant to be burdensome or oppressive, but instead they're meant to lead us to new freedom and new life. And this principle applies up and down the gospel, of course, right? And so think, for example, of today's gospel, the Gospel of Matthew chapter 22, where the Lord is asked the question, which is the greatest of the commandments? In response to which he says two things. So first of all, he says you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. And secondly, he says you must love your neighbor as yourself. Now again, on the face of it, you might think to yourself, well, gosh, now there's 12 commandments instead of the original 10, so that sounds burdensome and oppressive. But another way to look at it is that God is love. God is love, and so therefore our common vocation, regardless of who we are, is to become like God, to become persons of love, to find life through the sincere giving of oneself, as opposed to controlling, having, possessing, or taking. And what this gospel is telling us is that the path to achieve this is to bring everything into right relationship with God. Hence the whole business of the heart and the soul and the mind. And when you do that, you become like God, and you see like God. And in particular, you come to see other people not as persons to be used or persons to be feared, but rather as persons to be loved. Now, one of the best ways to illustrate this particular point is found in the Restore the Glory podcast with Dr. Bob Schuchts and Jake Khym, in the context of which they talk about this threefold paradigm to entering into the fullness of Christian discipleship, which basically includes 3 steps: security, maturity, and purity. And so to kind of frame this issue using a particular gospel text, think about the Gospel of Mark chapter 8, where Jesus heals this blind man from the region of Bethsaida. And so we think back to that particular story, the blind man is not healed right away, but instead there's certain preliminary steps which are taken. And so first of all, Jesus takes the man by the hand, so an image of security. Then he leads him outside the village, away from his place of comfort to places of vulnerability, where he's experienced alienation and rejection, an image of growth and maturity. And then only after that does he heal his sight, an image of purity. So again, security, maturity, and purity. But to kind of deal with these things in more detail, think about security. So when it comes to the notion of security, perhaps you might say that the whole goal of security is to become deeply rooted and grounded in the reality of God's love for us, which is no small thing, because oftentimes there's a huge gap between our theoretical knowledge of God and what we believe about God in our hearts. And so Dr. Bob Schuchts talks about this using an analogy of a child which is born when his father is at sea. And so maybe when his father's at sea and he hasn't met his father before, the mother tells the child as he's growing up all these different things about his father. But then when the father comes home, that's when the rubber hits the road. Do I believe what my mother has told me about my father when I experience my father in the flesh? And so the same thing happens when it comes to our relationship with God. Oftentimes, again, there's this huge gap between our theoretical knowledge of God and what we believe about God in our hearts. Now, certainly there's different approaches and techniques we can use to kind of, build our sense of security in God's love for us. And so perhaps one way through the guidance of the Holy Spirit is to examine various experiences and memories that we have, good or bad, which have affected our relationship with God and our level of trust in Him. But that said, whenever this particular topic shows up, what comes to mind is something that my spiritual director told me back in the day. And so basically what he said was that if you want to grow in trust, basically you just got to trust. In other words, even though one can read books about trust and pray for trust and think about the notion of trusting more in God, eventually you need to just act from that space, to try and take a chance and actually trust in the Lord. And so think of it like this. All of us have a checkered past, things we've done, things we failed to do. And all of us have sort of a complicated present, We're not just broken vessels, but we're actually broken and leaky vessels. And the world will tell us that until we can get our act together in terms of our, again, messy past and complicated present, we're not much use to anyone, both in the spiritual or temporal realm. But the gospel says something to us quite different. And so in a certain sense, the invitation from the gospel is to trust, to entrust our complicated past and our messy present to the Lord and to focus on loving Him in the present moment, trusting that God's glory will shine through our broken and leaky vessels. And that's why St. Padre Pio has this really great line. So basically what he says is, Lord, I entrust my past to your mercy, I entrust my present to your love, and I entrust my future to your providence. Okay, but that brings us to the second step, which again is maturity. And so maturity in the spiritual life is allowing the Lord to lead us out of our places of comfort to places of vulnerability and where we feel weak, such that we might become strong and grow in these areas to eventually enter into the full stature of the person of Christ. And the thing I want to impress upon you is that the way to kind of grow in maturity is not primarily through intellectual inquiry, but rather by focusing on Jesus and focusing on the duty of the moment. Where does he want me to be? What does he want me to do? To focus on a few things he wants me to do carefully and well in the context of the simple and the humble and the ordinary. And one of the best ways to illustrate this point is found in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 11. Come to me, all you who are weary, and find life burdensome, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and humble of heart, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Now, just focusing on this image of the yoke from this particular passage, a lot of times I think we kind of misinterpret this particular image. And so perhaps you might look at this image of the yoke and think, well, Jesus gives me this yoke, which is his cross, and the Father kind of watches me from afar, judging me harshly to see whether or not I carry the yoke or the cross appropriately. But here's the more appropriate way to look at this image. So the yoke is something which is put around the neck of an animal. And then there's this thing called the halter, which is this bar through which all the ropes go through, which is at the rear. And on top of that, a yoke would never be carried by simply one animal, but always by two or more animals. And so let's say, for example, there's a yoke with two animals. There would always be the mature animal and the immature animal paired together. And so you might imagine that in early going, the immature animal might try to insist on doing its own thing. But when it does so, things kind of go bad, right? So when it goes too fast, basically it's being choked by the yoke. But when it goes too slow, its legs are being hit by the halter, and that's uncomfortable. And so basically the immature animal eventually has to learn to pay attention not to itself, but instead to focus on the mature animal who has done this before, knows the route, knows the pace, knows what to do. And the whole idea is that only when the immature animal learns to focus not so much on itself, but on the mature animal who knows all the cues, only then does the yoke become easy and the burden become light. Okay, but that brings us to the third and final point, this notion of purity. And so when it comes to purity in the spiritual life, perhaps you might say that the most important passage is from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, 2519, which basically dictates the fruits of actually becoming pure of heart, which is basically twofold. And so first of all, when you become pure of heart, you see God more and more in the context of the world, and ultimately you come to see God in the context of the beatific vision at the end of your life. But then secondly, you become like God, which means that you come to see like God. And in particular, you come to see other people as God sees them. The world tends to reduce people to mere symptoms or externals. And so, for example, so-and-so is a narcissist, so-and-so is a control freak, so-and-so is a sex addict. Whereas in contrast, think about 1 Samuel chapter 16. The world looks to the outward appearance, but God looks to the heart. God looks to the entirety of the human person. And so the example that comes to mind is from the life of Father David Knight, who once said very provocatively that the holiest person he ever met in his entire life was a French prostitute. And you might ask yourself, how can that be? So the way he explains it is that he felt like he knew her heart. And in particular, he felt that because of her purity of heart, because of her desire for God, he knew where her life would eventually end up, even though right now she was still a prostitute. And such is the invitation for all of us, to see other people as God sees them, not in their brokenness, but in their wholeness, to see the entirety of the human person, to recognize and to reflect back to them their goodness and the possibilities for new life which exists even now, even as they struggle with various things in their lives. Okay, one final example, and I'll kind of end with this. And so this is from the life of Jake Khym, who is one of the co-hosts from the Sword of Glory podcast. And so Jake Khym is very open about the fact that back in the day he struggled massively with sexual addiction, pornography, and masturbation and whatnot. But eventually he achieved sexual freedom. So the way he describes it, he eventually got to the point where not only did he not lust after women, but also he didn't experience this massive sense of repression in doing so. So truly he achieved this place of chastity, real integrity when it came to the human person. But more to the point, he came to experience the fruit of this chastity over the course of one particular therapeutic relationship. And so the way he describes it, he was journeying with this young woman who had been sexually abused back before in the past. And to make a long story short, she eventually wrote a letter to the podcast saying that Jake Khym was the first man to ever look at her like Jesus. Not as an object of lust, not as someone to be used, but truly as a child of God, loved, beloved, and cherished right now in the present moment. And the thing I want to impress upon you, friends, is that that's a really tangible example of the fruit which can be obtained by loving God above all things, by truly loving Christ with all your hearts, all your soul, and all your minds. Truly you become like God, and on top of that you come to see like God. But more to the point, that look that you give to other people, as a result of achieving real purity of heart, that look itself can be healing, redemptive, and restorative, because it's the look of Jesus himself.